Firstly, I just want to say thank you very much for joining this very exciting joint event between SINERGY in Singapore. And I'd just like to introduce my colleague, Costas, who's the chair of SINERGY in Singapore, and this event with Synthetic Biology Australia, of which I'm the president. So my name is Robert Spades, and this is very exciting for us to have this joint event between these two regions of the world, who are real powerhouses in synthetic biology. I'd just like to start off from our perspective by acknowledging the First Nations owners of the lands where we all are in Australia. At least for me, that's the Turrbal and Yugara people. I'd just like to pay my respects to the elders, laws, customs and creation spirits of the peoples of the lands where we are meeting today. So we have a very, very exciting program over a couple of hours. We have a first hour, which is dedicated to company founders and people who are really on the ground doing startups and running companies in both Singapore and in Australia. And this session will be chaired by Anna Tao from CSIRO. We'll then hand over into the second hour, which we focused on investors. So for people who are thinking about potentially starting companies and what's that all about, and where do we get money, what do you got to think about, how do you make pictures and so on. So the second hour is going to be fantastic for that as well. So again, thank you for giving it your time and coming to the seminar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anna, who will introduce her panel and take it from there. So thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Yes. So my name is Anna Tao. I'm from the Australian National Science Agency called CSIRO. So hello from Brisbane, from Australia. So I'm delighted to moderate today's panels with the four panel members who is, as Robert described it, running the front line of amazing SynBio startups right now in Singapore and Australia. So the format for this session will be, I will introduce each of the panel members, ask them to introduce themselves with name and company they represent. Then we will move to an opening question for each one of them. And then we will open for the panel discussion with few of the questions. And then we'll follow by the Q&A sessions from the audience. So if I may, I would like to first introduce the first panel member, Alvin N. from ESCO ASTA. Alvin, can you hear me?
Yep, I can. And very good morning in Singapore, and also good afternoon to the audience in Australia. My name is Alvin. I am part of the corporate development team here in ESCO ASTA itself. Our founding CEO expresses his apologies as he's unable to make the event, but I'm happy to share our experiences at ESCO ASTA. A little short background about myself. I did my undergraduate studies in Brisbane at Griffith University. I understand because we have a few Queensland folks here, Anna and also Robert himself. And also I did my postgraduate studies with Carl Walkley and Jack Martin at the St. Vincent's Institute in the University of Melbourne. Here at ESCO ASTA, you may know of us as a CGMP grade contract development and manufacturing organization in itself. You may have seen us in the news recently because of some of our corporate clients have achieved the world's first regulatory approved cell-based food product itself, but we're also known for the other aspects of biologics, whether it's producing vaccines, producing cell-based therapies, so on and so forth. And if you're, for the audience in Australia, if you're making a trip to Singapore, I do welcome you to come and check out our facilities and also have a discussion to see if CDMO could be a good partner for your manufacturing needs. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Alvin. So thank you for the introductions. I have a question for you. So what is so as a CDMO provider and a biological producer yourself, what do you think is the advantage of partner with companies like you? I guess the question is the difference, what's the consideration between building in-house capability or partner with company like you?
Well, and I guess this always seems to be quite a binary question of binary choices, right? Whether it's building CAPEX, whether it's a CAPEX or OPEX in itself. I feel that for fast-moving R&D teams and startups, technical product feasibility shouldn't be one of the 99 problems that Jay-Z is singing about. And the last thing you want to have is to spend large amounts of funding on shiny new equipment and not having the right people or the know-how to make the best of those equipment itself. So here at ESCO Esther, our only job is to take your product and your technology and scale it through the different phases of bioprocess manufacturing. And because and on that note, your tech and your product will be in safe hands. In fact, so safe that quite a lot of investors do conduct due diligence on us and walk away with take approval, doing that their investments into cell-based, whether it's cell-based biologics startups or cell-based food startups, they know that their investments are in good hands, so to speak. But on that note about whether it's CAPEX or OPEX, my take on it really would be that there will be a right place and time for it. In fact, for some of our corporate clients right now, we are actually undergoing a bit of a reverse tech transfer in where we impart our best practices and our know-how to our clients so that they can conduct the bioprocess manufacturing on their own sites in itself. So I hope maybe, on that note, perhaps ESCO Esther could be the thruster rockets to a spaceship, so that, and we know that for founders out there, you have done a lot, in achieving liftoff. So why not join us and let's go for the moon together.
Thank you, Alvin. That's great. I have a few more questions for the panel discussion later, but that's a great answer. Thank you. The second panel member, I would like to introduce Kai Ling from the Shock Meet. Kai, hello.
Hi,
so if you can introduce yourself. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I'm Kai. I'm from Singapore and we're Shook Meats. If you're not familiar with the term Shook means delicious or fantastic. So we're delicious meats. We are a cultivated seafood and meats company, mostly focusing on shellfish like lobster, shrimp, crab. And we are still in R&D. We're working really hard towards commercialization next year in Singapore. So this year, really working a lot on the regulatory side and building our first pilot manufacturing plant in Singapore. We're also in the midst of setting up some small research labs in Thailand and in Australia, Sydney in particular. So if you're interested, please talk to us further. We're actively hiring in this places as well. Nice to meet all of you.
Thank you, Kai. Sounds like a really, really exciting next phase of Shock as you guys grow. So my question to you is, I guess you kind of hinted to is, when do you expect to get your first products into the market? And I guess in that journeys, what is the biggest challenge you think at the moment?
Yes, thanks, Anna. Yeah, we're hoping to launch our first product in the market in Singapore next year, so 2023, and that will be our shrimp product. And then later on, we'll release further products. And what are the biggest challenge? I would say the biggest challenges are regulatory, because I think right now there's only one country in the world that has approved any kind of cultivated product. So Singapore is the only place, but it has only done for one type of product so far. So everything else is still a black box. It's still unclear how it is. But the Singapore Food Agency has been really supportive and interested to work with different companies to get us commercialized and making sure the food product is safe as well. So I think that's the biggest challenge, and also building on our own manufacturing facility is definitely, with the current supply chain issues and funding challenges. I think that's another huge area which I think ESCO will be able to support some, but there's quite a lot of companies out here as well, so it's difficult for them to support everyone. So some of us will also need to build our own manufacturing facilities at some point. So I think that's the other big challenges we face. And lastly, I would say hiring. Surprisingly, I think right now, even though the market is not so positive, but I think hiring has been more challenging than previously in the last 2 years during COVID. So I think that's another challenge we have been seeing.
Okay, thank you, Kai. Thank you. I would like to introduce the third panel from Nourish Ingredients, Anna El-Tachi.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Hello. Yes, Anna, would you like to introduce yourself and the company first?
Yep. So I'm Anna El-Tachi. So my role at Nourish Ingredients is the Chief Technical Officer. So I look after the R&D technology and getting that product up and ready and prototypes, proof of concepts, etc. So I'm originally a biochemist. I did a double degree in food chemistry and genomics, which suited well what I'm doing today because it brings both together. So we are at Nourish Ingredients, we're trying to produce alternative fats through microbial engineering. And that's to supplement the plant-based products with the good taste that everyone's looking for. So the animal perception and the texture and the taste function. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. So my question is, as you described, Nourish is focused on become the fat ingredient producers for animal plant meat. So I guess what's the thinking behind that? Like, why do you guys decide to go for that kind of fat bioproduction focus instead of a consumer-facing, solution?
Yeah, so I'll step back a bit and I'll describe how we realized the need for that. So back in 2019, there was a huge demand in the market that we've identified because although there is a huge trend in the plant-based products, there was still that customer turnover because the consumers are not really liking the taste of these products back 2 years ago. So we realized that there's a missing component in them, and the missing ingredient was the fat. And because we are lipid engineers, I come from CSIRO as well as you. So we did the omega-3 engineering as alternative fish oil products and sources. And this is where we realized, like, we know how to do that. We know how to solve the problem. And so the two co-founders went and founded Nourish late 2019, and we started addressing it. And we were so impressed by our own product. As you know, we sniffed that fat, and it did take us to the animal perception, which is like we realized, oh yeah, this is really like a burning steak or grilled steak. So we started deep, like diving into the technology itself, and now we're looking at 3 different products because the fat is the core for the taste and texture. So we can tailor it to meet the meat flavor and aroma, the dairy flavor and aroma, and the food texture itself. So the problem there is that these industries were using palm and coconut oil, and they are still doing that. Although in the plant oil, you don't have the right compositions that are existing in the meat. So you'd have to go and engineer it in a way. And we found the microbial fermentation is the best and quickest way to do that. So that's what we're doing today. Why we're not looking at consumer product, I don't think we have made a decision not to look at that yet. So we kind of are still neutral. We realize that there's a huge potential in what we're doing and the product we're offering. Because as the protein is a great component in the food, the fat is also that equivalent, and it's the core for its function. So we are still open to which direction we would take. We are a bit like really focused B2B at this stage because we're a startup and we can't do everything ourselves. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to be looking at, the other direction down the track.
Thank you. And I think as any startup can speak about is you may have this pivot as the market is ready or when things is ready, right? So thank you for that. And I would like to introduce our last panel member, Gustavo. Can you hear me, Gustavo? From Cluster Biotechnology. I don't think I can hear you.
Can you hear me now, Anna?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much. So my name is Gustavo de Siqueira. I'm the founder of Cluster Biotechnology, have been running the company for many years now. And I think everything started back in 2015 when we started running the company. But before that, I was actually being largely trained by Australian academia, same as many of you guys. And I had a period of time at Monash University, and that's where I did one of my postdocs. And then after Monash, I lectured at James Cook University. And that was a fantastic experience, lecturing to hundreds of kids, smart kids, all at the same time. And but before that, I learned a lot of synthetic biology at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And I think for me, that was the best contact with the molecular technologies that we use nowadays. And then back then, we were expressing marker genes and antimicrobial resistance, and a number of other traceable characteristics. And I think at some stage I realized potential in actually making a difference to market and bringing something new that people actually need. And in Australia in 2015, that's when we set up Cluster Biotechnology to listen to industry and start small and scale up and grow as the synthetic biology market grows. And back then, we didn't know much about potential, about directions, and we were pretty much led by industry. They told us what they needed at that point in time. And then understanding that things would evolve, we started looking into the future and trying to make those predictions. And I'll probably talk about this later. But basically what Cluster does these days is, since 2015, we then evolved as a company. And we became a service provider, and the service provider now has experience working with a large number of Australian companies, just starting to collaborate with a few companies overseas as well. And our focus is mostly probiotic biotechnology and synthetic biology in that arena as well. But we have developed chemical products as well, and more recently trying to encompass all that in the clinical field. Because if we're able to develop something, we need to learn even more skills to be able to downstream test clinically using animal models or human participants. And I think that as a service provider, this is what Cluster is these days. It's pretty much an industry hub where startups and scale-ups like us, but also industry, comes to develop, test, and validate their products.
Thank you, Gustavo. My question to you is, I think it's similar to what I've asked around ESCO Esther. So what is the right time for startups, as a service provider, to invest into scale-ups from your point of view? And what are the key considerations?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. Thank you. So I think one of the things we learned, it's a very challenging market, and especially because we're still learning so much about synthetic biology. I think it's when you become able to make those predictions about your business. Is my business really going to grow? Do I have enough customers? Is there a demand? Do I have enough money? And the products that I'm going to supply? And I'm talking all these as a service provider, but I think that, for example, a particular company that is looking at conducting their own in-house research and bringing one product to market, it's also about understanding industry mentality, how I'm going to bring something to the supply chain, and is it going to be realistic and functional? And what is the realistic demand, and will I have money to actually reach that scale? So I think the right moment to actually scale up is when you're prepared to at least answer most of these questions in a, it's never risk-free, but minimizing your risk of actually having issues.
Thank you, Gustavo. So I would like now open the conversation to the whole panels. Yes, so if all the panelists can put the video on. I think there's some common questions now popping up through all the answers you just provided. As we see, the topics today is around kind of let's bring SynBio into the market, right? So some of the questions we've talked about, I think what I would like to start with is, from different point of view, whether it's service providers or startups in the SynBio space delivering consumer or ingredients, what does it take from your point of view to move from actually a lab concept to real commercialization? I guess the follow-on question is, what role does university or government and corporate play as the SynBio market grow into the next stage? I think that's two questions. The first question is, what does it take from your point of view, your experience? Who would like to go first?
I can.
Okay.
I can keep it short because it's a lot of pain, a lot of passion, and a lot of excitement, all combined. Though, to be serious, there's the whole pain is because a startup, it's as soon as you start internalizing the R&D, you're kind of fitting it from the scratch. And with what we're doing today, some of that may be novel, that there's no ecosystem built for it, and this is where all the heavy lifting is needed. though there's a whole passion because we're creating a new thing, there's a whole impact that we're bringing into the globe, and we're solving a huge problem. So I'm personally, I've got a whole drive into this.
So passion and building a whole industry is the key to grow it, right? Thank you.
For me, I kind of hand it over when there's deregulation to be taken care of, because that's the most painful part.
Yes.
I think taking a more practical viewpoint on how moving from the lab concept into commercialization, I think one of the first steps is to find what is the uniqueness of what you're doing. And some of the ways that investors see it, which is how you get funding to move from a lab to move to its commercialization, is whether you have a patent, something that you can protect, whether you're doing this by a trade secret that is not so easy, but in some ways as well. But I think those are some of the ways that people have tried to move from a lab scale, or just in a research setting, and move towards commercialization. You need to find a way to be able to protect your idea, to make sure it's novel enough so that people putting in money to support you have a way to protect their investments as well. So finding what is unique, protecting it, and then finding funding so you can be able to scale, hire the people, build your own labs. Those are some of the first steps that we took when we are moving to its commercialization. I think along the way, how corporate, government, universities can play a role. Governments like Singapore, they do have some funding opportunities for startups when trying to move and start your own startup. They have some grants available, so those are, and I think Australia has a lot of those as well. So those are good opportunity for you to find funding to work on your concept, and then universities and corporate generally become research partners or commercialization partners for what you're working on. I think those are some of my experiences. We built Shootmeats.
Thank you, Kai. Alvin, Gustavo, do you have any comments? Whether it's the first question, concept to commercialization, or the second question around the role of university, corporate, and government?
Yeah, I think everyone raised a really good point, so just, sorry, was that for me?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Alvin? Okay. So I think one of the things that, I learned that many companies out there have been looking more strongly is the element of impact, so bringing something to market, when you start looking into, okay, I'm going to translate something from the bench to industry. Is it realistic? And is it going to answer a question? And what is the actual impact of my development? And how is it going to come to market? And who's going to buy? And so all these things that obviously get answered throughout the startup stage. But I think once you start doing research at the bench level, let's say, for example, a particular university group, and now I'm wearing my hat not only as cluster founder, but also as an investor, because I am a venture partner in an investment group. And we're looking for, everything that you guys said before, passion, drive, but also learning about the technology and the IP protection. The IP element is very, very important, and also the impact. So is your technology disruptive, and is you gonna maybe add upon existing efforts? And so I think that element of realism is very, very important.
Thank you, Evan.
Yeah, I guess I find myself nodding my head across all the comments that were being made by the panelists itself. And also at the same time, here at Esther, right, we deal with clients that are either your large food corporates that are potentially looking at a white label approach to cell-based food, or the startups themselves, or the spin-offs themselves that are looking to scale their product in itself. So I guess for concept proofing of the commercialization part, because we are on the slightly downstream end of things, where we look at potentially helping our clients file for the dossiers for regulatory approval, all the way down to helping with formulating the final food product in itself. So I would say that it does. I mean, it's like a nice salad in itself. You need the right mix of everything. I think a lot of these elements have been mentioned by our panelists here today, but also at the same time, closer towards bringing a food product to the table itself. I guess we're looking at slightly more technical aspects about whether it's feasible as a food product. But also at the same time, we talk about universities, we talk about governments, we talk about corporates, right? I think in Singapore, we are privileged that the government has a push for food security in that sense. And because we don't really have that large of a conventional agricultural industry here in Singapore itself, we face a lot less pressure for some of our cell-based food startups to flourish, in this part of the world. And we are looking at, say, for example, some of our potential clients in other parts of the world where, the beef industry has it contributes to such a large fraction to their economy itself. So for them to bring out a cell-based food product does and will have its own challenges in its own right. So I believe the market growth still needs a little bit of support from various aspects, whether it's the government all the way down to some of the large corporates that are working with some of the smaller startups and spin-offs in itself. Yeah.
I think one thing, Alvin, you just pointed out is as the industry and the market, such as cell and meat, for example, growing beyond the first adopters like Singapore, I think this is where we want to see corporates and, these partners comes when you go into different markets. As you said, the dynamics fundamentally different, right? So this is where I think partnerships will come really useful. Leads to the second question, actually. I think, Kai, you have mentioned it a little bit, and also Alvin, actually, around talent, right? So I think the question I want to ask all of you is, where do you see the skill gaps across the value chain, whether it was in your company or in the industry? And I guess the follow-on question, again, is how we can solve it together. What's the role as startup, but also policymakers and corporate to actually accelerate it? I think talent shortage is a topic, a really important topic that I'm hearing a lot in Australia. I'm sure it's happening in Singapore as well. So that's the question. What's the skill gap? Yeah.
And touch on that one very quickly, Anna. A few days ago, I had a meeting with an organization called Cellular Agriculture Australia, and they have a very interesting mindset. So they are receiving funds from investors and from organizations overseas. Actually, for the very first year, put money into early stage or junior students, for example, doing masters in honors. And I met up with those guys, with the leadership team, and their mindset's just phenomenal. They are preparing the next generation of Australian biotechnologies at the junior level with a level of funding. It's an entry level, but it's very, very positive because they are looking to strengthening those capabilities inside of university, and giving training and increasing the level of employability. And I think, I'm somehow being an advocate for those guys now, because I think that they touched at some stage during the meeting something very important. There will be a shortage of talent. We are not preparing enough people for, synthetic biology outcomes, biotechnology, and there have also been a brain erosion in Australia, which is quite scary. And so our universities, pumping a certain level of highly trained, highly qualified people that sometimes leave and never come back. So I think that some of these, aspects we have to work also with industry and organization, benefactors, and especially government.
I'd also add one thing here, from our experience when Nourish was founded, it was late 2019, and this is where COVID started. So it was, the decision, let's internalize the R&D, but we couldn't actually get anyone to join because there was no travels, the borders were shut. So which actually, this is where we realized that the world is changing. Now we're more open to remote working. You can see consultants, they don't have to all be inside, working in the same space. So that's our strategy that we took, and that's how it's working today for us. It was only until April last year that we were able to get 2 international hires to join us. So it was 2 years of struggles. From what we see, in our own technology, the gaps are mainly in the precision fermentation. because there's a lot of competition on bioprocessing. There's a lot of shortage on these skills, and there's only a few ones in Australia, as well as, you know, you can count them. They are really skilled in that microbial bioprocessing and even oil downstream extraction for us.
So I think, you know, kind of link back to what Gustavo also highlighted is kind of that, you know, having these people's interest and passion and go into the space and get exposure into the real world trainings. And, you know, maybe that's where a startup can also join forces together with organization like CELAC. Yep. Kai?
Yeah, adding on to what Anna and Gustavo have mentioned, I think for us, the skill gaps usually come from the bioprocess side. Engineers are very hard to get, especially during COVID. The vaccine industry is very active and offer very high salaries. So it's very hard for startups like us to be able to compete on that level with pharmaceutical companies. But, you know, we do see some, so I think that area is definitely a gap. The other gap that is interesting that I think from schools and corporate and startups to look into is that the bridge between food and biotechnology side. We have people who understand the biomaterials, we have people who understand food, but there's rarely people who really bridge and understand both sides together. And I think you see some of this when trying to apply some of the tissue engineering skills we have in making organs, but they don't actually work when you try to heat them up or you need them to be stable at a certain temperature for a long time. So these are things that we've seen that, you know, there are some unique individuals who have explored both areas, but, you know, it could be kind of in universities, people might start offering double degrees in food technology and life sciences, so they get to experience both and try to look into both of these areas together. I think those are interesting. I think what's like Australia and New Harvest trying to give project funding to support research for young students is very good. The other area I think for corporate startups to do, I think we see is to really encourage or, you know, share the alternative of synthetic biology and cultivated meats, as they already have the skills. It's just whether they're interested to apply it for a different application. I think that's often something we find really helpful or interesting to look into. The other point I wanted to bring up is that now that borders are open, but we do see in Singapore it's getting harder and harder to hire foreign talent. I think the government wants to encourage local hiring, which we all want to hire locals, but for some talents or some skill sets, that's not really possible immediately to hire locally. So you do need to tap on foreign talent to bring them in to train local talent so you can hire and build the skill force in-house. So I mean, I think this is something we see in different countries as well, that it's not always easy to bring in foreign talent, but sometimes you just have no choice where you want or the skill sets you need are not available locally.
Just to echo some of our panelists have been mentioning about, you know, trying to shorten skill gaps, right? I think in Singapore and in Australia, I think we are quite blessed to have a good mix of institutions of higher learning, whether it's in the TAFEs and the polytechnics here in Singapore, or some of the universities that are more tech-based, like the likes of your QUT, UTS, etc. And I think early exposure to cellular agriculture, early exposure to cell-based foods will be helpful. You know, whether through initiatives where we're exposing them, you know, whether it's from third-year projects all the way up to honors, master's level projects in itself, and then build up the interest and awareness so that when they, you know, when they want to enter the industry itself, they come in with a little bit more knowledge and probably a little bit more insights to value add to the rest of the team in itself. And I guess on the other hand, corporates like ourselves that are slightly larger than startups, and also from startups, can also work more closely, I guess, with the institutions of higher learning to really say, hey, you know, some of our projects, and some aspects of it may not be the most commercially sensitive, but we're happy to take on students, whether it's at the undergrad or postgrad levels, and then let's see how we can work things together. And naturally, some institutions have their own restrictions or their own boundaries in terms of IP creation, but that's a separate topic that we can talk about it, sometime later on a different forum in itself.
I think what you hinted on actually is there's some, I guess, non-competitive question that the industry need to solve together, and these are something that we might want to join forces and bring that into the universities and do these early research. So I think it's important to have these conversations like this and to say which are the ones that we need to do it together, because none of us individually can solve it alone. So that's a really good point. Thank you, Alvin. And just a reminder for the participants, don't forget to put your Q&A questions in. We will be opening Q&A really soon. But I have a few more questions before we go into that process. I guess the third question I have is scaling. So big questions, and as narration, Shock is moving to commercialization, exciting times. I think that's the big topic everybody is thinking of about scaling. So the question is, what are the considerations of scaling the infrastructure and the skills? And I guess the related question is, what kind of financing actually you would need to build these factories your own or partner with others without delaying without delaying your actual product development. You need to scaling and work on the product. What are the considerations and financing you guys have explored or have thought about?
So we, from Nourish perspective, go. Sorry. Go.
No.
Okay, so we when we realized a main part of our infrastructure is having a manufacturing organization that has GM and food grade capacities. So we realized there's none of that in Australia. So we went and applied for a business grant, and the government has funded part of our work, which we're now trying to upscale the existing CMO in the region to make that a GM and a food grade combined. So that's not going to solve our scaling problem. There's a whole lot of money needed to be put into that space, and there's a lot of activities going on in Australia and also Singapore, I know, and I'm visiting that in October sometime, just to enable that technology to be scalable and get to the market at good cost of goods rates.
Yeah, so I was just going to say really quickly, I think in terms of scaling, it's really interesting. So we're still learning what is actually really necessary. So there is we're all talking about advanced manufacturing, and how much do we realistically need to scale for a particular ingredient might be different from another one, for example, or for a finished product. So, is there a resource to actually engineer a particular ingredient or a product in Australia and but get a finished one produced and quality controlled overseas and then come back? Is it going to be more of the same, but is perhaps the best way? And then all these, the pathway to success will influence financing, because most of the financing, to my humble knowledge, is still coming from investors. Governments, they have money, but they also have somehow limited resources in relation to how much risk they can take in new technologies like synthetic biology and precision biofermentation and all those things. So I think when it comes to scale, and now thinking about my organization as a service provider, same as Alvin, so it's really, really interesting. So our very first, and I have a list of things here, but our very first upscaling event happened in collaboration with government. And that's because it absolutely de-risked for us. They put together a phenomenal, set of PC1 and PC2 laboratories. Without those guys, we would not actually have been able to invest that much money up front. And that was for us a mechanism of de-risking back in 2019. And it's really interesting because at the same time that we received government support to essentially move into a new headquarters and deliver our talent and grow and expand, now in 2022, they said, look, I'm really sorry, but we have reached our limit in relation to physical building. And now you're going to have, if you want to keep scaling, you have to go somewhere else. And I think for us, that's when we learned something else about scale, or upscaling a service provider. who else is out there who can help and work with us on upscaling the delivery of services in synthetic biology.
Thank you, Gustavo. That's really good because it sounds like you guys are actually in this question right now about what's the financing going to look like. It sounds like government did such a great job of building a foundation together with you, but now you're looking at exploring other financing options. As Kai, you probably going to jump on is infrastructure costs a lot, right? You've mentioned that briefly already. You guys are considering. Love to know your opinion. What you're thinking about it at the moment.
Yeah, I think echoing what Anna and Gustavo have mentioned, it's really to see what is available. And unfortunately, for cultivated meats and seafood, there's not many available facilities. I think ESCO is one of the only ones around the world available. So we have been looking to set our own to scale to a certain point. But most of this financing will have to be private investments because government support, at least at our scale, is not really looking into supporting our scaling of our infrastructure. I think that's kind of our experience in looking into it.
So just to follow on that question, so you're saying government is not interested. Is it too small or too big? Sorry, I wasn't sure. What's government's take?
I think it's really not too big. I mean, not big enough.
It's not big enough. Okay. Yeah. So is that kind of awkward in the middle point?
It's an awkward. Awkward point. Yeah.
Okay. Alvin?
Yeah. I guess most people know ESCO Esther as the folks who help one of the recent commercial clients, for the cell-based food product itself. But if you trace a little bit back to the corporate history of ESCO Life Sciences as a parent company, we've been building clean rooms since the 1970s, and also from the late 80s to 90s onwards. We've been building a lot of the biomedical laboratory equipment that are seen in your PC1, PC2 labs, all the way up to some of our large pharma clients in itself. So we kind of are in this kind of left-hand, right-hand situation where if needed, we can supply the equipment, we can build the clean rooms, to whichever grade. I think on our side, we have it up to GMP, and because we also serve pharma clients in itself, so it's also CGMP up to phase 1, phase 2 levels for them to engage and embark on clinical trials. But also at the same time, we can offer that service as well. But we have, from an observation point of view, we have seen quite a few of our corporate clients. They do take up, maybe if it's not equity-based funding, they do take up a bit of debt funding in itself. But that debt funding also, I think in Australia is still, I would dare say, a little bit more nascent in terms of, like I say, for example, you talk about venture debt, it's mainly, I guess, the folks at Tractor Ventures, for example. But I think over here in Singapore, venture debt funding is a fair mix between equity and also the debt part aspect itself. But I guess it also comes down to some of our corporate clients and how far they are in putting that cell-based food product or that biologics product, on the food table itself, or in the shelves for therapeutic purposes in itself. I mean, we have, I guess for us, it's a case-by-case basis where we work with our corporate clients, depending on what their needs are. And rightfully, I think for some of our corporate clients, we have been, we have helped them scale up to a certain extent, but also, be involved in their planning when they build up their own physical facilities, such that we can just, impart back what we know what to do, and then they can take it on from their end itself. But with regards to government investments, right? I guess I'm not really the most familiar about the current situation in Australia. Hopefully, Alvo and the Labour government does its right things to support cellular agri and also biologics capabilities in itself for the next 4 or 5 years. But I think here in Singapore, I guess there are some government-based facilities. Some of them are parked through the institutions of higher learning, some of the universities here that we have. But as Kai mentioned, I think at a certain point of time, and also Gustavo's probably observed that, at a certain point of time, when you need to grow and scale, I think that's where the universities or the institutions of higher learning, wave their hands goodbye and say you're kind of on your own in itself. And I think this is growing pains that will be observed, whether it's in Singapore and Australia and also other parts of the world in itself. Just my personal 2 cents on it. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Alvin. Actually, we have a question from the audience around scaling. So from Ravi to the panelists. So excellent point on scaling. Are you all looking for contract fermentation in different geographics? So he highlighted India as an example. This could be something to work out with close collaborations with government level promoting this outside of the Australia or Singapore. Have you looked at other geographics and what have you seen so far?
I think for me, when we look for contract manufacturers, it's hard to find any that are able to support the cultivated meats and seafood. I think ESCO is the only one that I've seen so far. I think there might be more of an institutional based one in California as well, depending on what scale you're looking at. But there are very few that we've seen. I think for precision fermentation, there are probably a lot more options out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm just gonna touch very quickly. So I think as a service, delegation of tasks, when the industry or startups, they come to us, for example, there is an element of fear in terms of IP protection, and obviously just sharing this with all of you because IP is one of the biggest things that attracts investors. And without IP being involved, investor will say, well, how can I, help you protect your business? And one of the things I experienced a little bit of resistance with our customers is to actually receive those synthetic biology contracts and pass on to people overseas and other organizations. And not, they don't have anyone in particular in mind in relation to expressing that element of resistance. But it's just the fear of being so far away and not really knowing what's happening over there. And then eventually all that turns, back into a negative result. And look, I'm sorry, we followed your protocol or your suggestions and everything failed. And, but thank you anyway for coming. And it's a little bit, when it comes to services, it's a little bit of an issue at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point around trust and how to do it, beyond your first early adopters. Alvin, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I guess with regards to, I think, say, for example, fermentation or precision fermentation for food purposes, right? I guess we do have quite a few facilities outside of Singapore in itself, where we have other manufacturing presences in countries where IP protection and best practices are being put in place. So I think that may allow some of our corporate clients to benefit from reduced costings in itself. But back to the IP issue that Gustavo mentioned, I think this is something that's also very common that we see as a potential concern from existing and upcoming commercial clients itself, especially where if we are serving two clients at the same time and they're working on something very similar, would there be a risk of IP that's leaked between team A versus team B within our organization itself? But I think I'm happy to say in public that we do have quite a few policies and best practices such that we separate out those two teams that are serving different clients, and those IP have been firewall, in that prevents that sharing of the secret source or the secret know-how. Some of them may not be patented. It's actually just proprietary trade secrets to actually enable their products to grow. Because for us, at the end of the day, our success largely depends on our commercial clients to succeed in the marketplace. So to bring the food product to food or biologics products, to get it regulatory approved, and then for them to succeed in the marketplace. So on that note, we do value the protection of IP, whether it's patents or trade secrets in itself, and we do make sure that these things are being safeguarded for the sake of our clients.
Yeah, I just want to say something really quickly. I think Alvin highlighted something that happened to me as well at some stage, which is the trade secret element. And some people expressed, potential issues with trade secret and revealing those protocols. And one thing that, it just comes to mind now, but could be potentially interesting, is the establishment of confident partnerships, bilateral agreements where a particular company, for example, a service provider in Australia, that has those specific strengths and attracts, industry partners and interest in developing ingredients, products, and conducting projects, can have that partner, that counterpart partner of choice in a particular country, in a particular economy, that will essentially facilitate the export mechanism as well. That would be very beneficial. But I think that in terms of just purely delegating tasks to unknown companies that sometimes don't belong to a network, I think would be risky. But the establishment of bilateral agreements, that would be very, very positive. And hopefully even involving uni, CSRO, and other groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something worth exploring, from a service provider point of view. But also at the same time, I guess the other interesting point to point out, so to speak, is that there are times where we have seen commercial clients not being. I think when that trust relationship hasn't been fully established, they have legitimate concerns about whether they can show us fully everything. But on our end, mainly our concerns is because the clock is ticking. We need to replicate the experimental protocols in our own hands before we scale it up, whether it's from a shake flask all the way up to some of your larger bioreactors, so to speak. So, and if we don't know completely about how to do it in our own hands, sometimes it makes it a bit harder and may actually impede on commercial project progress itself. But absolutely, we are all for putting in the frameworks to safeguard IP protection for and really to benefit the cell-based food and the biologics industries across Singapore, Australia, and the greater APAC region as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Alvin. I'm conscious of time, so I probably have one more question to ask. The question is about market and consumers. So what is the science-based consumer education awareness that you think you needed to connect the consumers? I know that there's some, as Kai have highlighted, there is products in the cell-based ag in the market, but it's really early stage. There's only one that's happening in the market with technologies, whether it is cellular agriculture or precision fermentation. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of consumer education. I think maybe I'll put in another perspective is stakeholder communication. So you've talked about regulatory partners. I think that part of the communication is also important. So love to have your inputs or thinkings on how you're approaching this at the moment.
I think I can start. In general, cultivated meats, precision fermentation, all these alternative proteins are still relatively new for most consumers. So I think in general, our strategy has been to be open and to get on as many science education events to interact with consumers as possible. So this is while we're still R&D stage. I think once we're towards commercial, I think what we see as really important to be with for consumers to gain trust is transparency, to be able to share with them as much information as we can on the product, on the process, so that they gain confidence and can make their own choice about the product. I think that's kind of our thoughts and strategy about raising awareness and education.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things I learned working, in industry and in that interface, industry, startups, and academia over the years, is that people in market likes entertainment and education. It's just fascinating. If you're making someone happy, they will buy. But if you're also educating and teaching something new, they will get that as well. And I think, I don't know, the way how I see synthetic biology and the potential evolution of the field, addressing gaps, but also potentially disrupting markets, it's about maybe working with policy makers, So this is actually one of the meetings I had last week with one, politician here, or former politician, I should say, from New South Wales. And he was telling me everything about mental health related policies. And how can we actually develop products that will empower people and restore their health or alleviate symptoms and a number of other things. And I think for me, as a technical person, it was actually very interesting to actually learn from their point of view. How is it politicians think and regulatory time framers actually envisage the future of synthetic biology. And so it's all about making their job easier as well. You know, they want to see Australian exporting, they want to see technology and innovation market, and working with them perhaps from the get-go. So when we have a new idea, maybe involving, you know, legislators, will be in a position to drive that, you know, the design of the roadmap to success from an impact perspective.
And Alvin, any comments?
Yeah, I think we will not have a great issue, because as soon as we bring that taste missing components, it will change the whole consumer experience. And you know, the first version of plant-based foods have already made a huge disruption in the market by bringing in the GM, even in Australia with the arrival of Impossible burgers. So it's actually opened up a space that's going to enable us even further to create a higher impact and bring more consumers' acceptance into these products. So I'm feeling hopeful and optimistic. Yeah.
So I think what you touch on is, at the end of the day, taste is the king, like the experience. I think what Gustavo is talking about is that entertainment is like, I have a really positive, really, really great exotic experience, and I love it. That we're gonna push for the consumer awareness. We're talking about foods, right? So I think that still, end of the day, is the most important thing. You're right. I agree with you. I think while we need to do a lot more in the stakeholder communications, that product development is the king of design. Alvin, any comments?
Yeah, just going to quickly comment on, I guess, the other aspects. I think a lot of our panelists today talk about tasting, talk about engaging consumers directly, and in fact, I guess, and besides Impossible, right? I think Australia also do have a formidable plant-based rival, B2 Foods, because I see Phil is going to probably talk about that later in the investor panel in itself. But also at the same time, I guess when we're getting the food products, the eventual food products to the consumer itself, right? I guess there will be product distributors, there will be supermarket chains, or whether we're selling direct, and each part of that value chain probably needs to be engaged now while our food product is being formulated, so to speak. And the sooner we get to know about their concerns and perspectives, it's easier to then, it makes it a lot more smoother in itself, because the last thing you want is to create a food product, you price it wrongly, or you're targeting an inappropriate aspect of the customer segments, and then that product market fit might just impede progress for all the efforts that have been put in just to produce that cell-based food product in itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my take on that is, when you design these go-to-market strategies, it's important to understand the end users, drivers, but that whole value chain approach, whether it's to distributors, your partners, your policymakers, or regulators, is all important stakeholders. I think that this is where Sarah is also doing a lot more in the social science aspect, is that complexity of that stakeholder engagement that we can build. I think that's where university and the research can also come in as the industry grow. Thank you, and thank you for your time. We're a bit over time, but I really enjoyed the panel discussions. And I will now hand it over back to Kostas.